Hi, and welcome, Cody. Thanks so much for meeting with me across the world.
Thanks for having me. It's exciting.
I was wondering if you would mind introducing yourself a bit about the context of your work, the context of you in your work, and also if you want to share what pronoun you prefer.
Sure. So I'm Cody Sanders. I use he, him pronouns. And I live currently in Boston, Massachusetts. I'm from the southeastern United States. But I moved to Boston about almost 6 years ago now. And here I'm the pastor of a little Peace and Justice congregation in Harvard Square, Old Cambridge Baptist Church. And I also serve as the American Baptist chaplain at Harvard University and the advisor for LGBTQ affairs in the Office of Religious, Spiritual, and Ethical Life at MIT. And do some teaching at places like Chicago Theological Seminary and Fordham University. In those contexts, I'm typically teaching people who are training for ministry positions. So some chaplains in hospitals or hospices or military chaplaincies, people who are going into parish ministry, things of that nature.
And you've just published some really valuable research that certainly fits with the frameworks that narrative practitioners are working from. I was wondering if you could introduce us to this body of work, if there were any stories that stood out about this research, maybe something that came out of it that surprised you, something that excited you, something that distressed you, all of the above.
Let me say a little bit about the work and how it came about. So the book that just came out this past July is called Christianity, LGBTQ Suicide, and the Souls of Queer Folk with Lexington Press, imprint of Roman and Littlefield. And the book emerged from my dissertation research. And the way I got into this was that I was beginning my research with a really keen interest in how religious and spiritual and theological narratives fuel practices of violence against LGBTQ people. And back then I was really interested in hate crime violence. And, as a gay person who grew up in a pretty conservative religious environment, I was very interested personally in how these narratives work on LGBTQ people and how we do work on those and with those narratives. And when I went to start this research in my PhD program, I was sort of struck by this long string of LGBT teen suicides that occurred in the fall of 2009, and started to realize how religious, spiritual, theological narratives can work on us at a different level, not just fueling overt violence, but also operating violently against our deepest sense of who we are as human beings, the sort of meaning-making core sense of coreness of who we are. What I've used in this book is with the metaphor of soul to point to that kind of meaning-making sense of coreness. So the narratives I heard in this research were from LGBT people who all had a suicide attempt at some point in their life, survived, and were at least 2 years removed from that suicide attempt. But in some cases, they were 20 or 30 years removed from that suicide attempt. So I was interested in how the narratives informed their sense of self leading up to a suicide attempt, and also how in the intervening years they worked with those narratives toward the project of surviving and thriving in their lives. And the stories I heard were just incredibly rich and uncovered a lot of nuance and detail that I found to be missing from most of the social science research on LGBT suicide.
I really love the language that you use of stories working on people. I think that's such an interesting way of articulating the power of discourse that we as narrative practitioners are really attentive to. And as you were just also mentioning, the way that people work on stories in order to reshape them, and of course the ways in which that happens on an individual and collective level. I was wondering, from the interviews that you did, when you found that folks that you were speaking to were able to work on these same narratives, sometimes really continuing on a lot of the same threads that might have once been harmful. What was it that seemed to make it more possible for people to claim a sense of ownership and agency around the narratives?
Yeah, that's a really nice question, because the contexts were so different for the different participants. And I was struck by how some of them pretty quickly began to make some movements and migrations toward other religious communities that were more affirming and that helped them to develop theological narratives that countered the violent narratives that operated so violently against their sense of soul. So that sense of exodus or spiritual migration to other places and communities helped. But there were a lot of people for whom that wasn't possible. For example, there was one man I interviewed called Thomas in the research, who was around 50 when I interviewed him, and he was around 20 when he had his suicide attempts. And in those decades between the suicide attempts and our interview, he had never been a part of a church or a community, a faith community of any kind, but his theological language and way of making sense of his life within an ultimate context was so robust that at the end of the interview, I asked him, you've certainly read some queer theology, it sounds like. And he said, what is queer theology? I mean, he had done all of this work without any kind of community to support him, and without even knowing that there were, professional theologians who were doing this kind of work too. And I have a quote that I pulled up from Thomas that I want to read. And this is something I think really encapsulates the agency and resilience of some of my participants. He said, I became calm enough to realize that I would rather jettison the teachings that I had been given about God and Christ and the Holy Spirit and the kingdom of God, and hold on to my faith in Christ. And if it meant that I never had a community ever again, F it, I would just take it, because my faith is more important. My faith is the only thing. I couldn't explain it. And so he, at the margins of any kind of formal community, did some really complex work to disentangle the narratives that were informing his sense of who he was as a person in relation to others, and in relation, in his theological language, to God or to Christ. And that was one of the pieces that was really important, is that for almost all of my participants, there were really death-dealing, violent narratives running right alongside and intertwined with narratives that were life-giving, life-sustaining, that informed their sense of self in some ways that they didn't want to let go of. So becoming what I call, transgressive theologians, they were able to do that deconstructive and reconstructive work to make sense of their lives differently. And some of them, used a whole different set of theological tools to do that. They might have left their Christian background or community and adopted Buddhist practices, or adopted healing drumming circle practices in one case. But for all of these participants, there was this agential resilience in their stories, that they were not willing to have their lives and their sense of faith or spirituality dictated to them anymore. And they were able to take some agency from these powerful producers of discourse in their life and work on those narratives so that they were able to survive and thrive, and in a couple of cases become religious leaders of communities or things of that nature too.
Yeah, it makes me so curious about what were the pieces that made that possible? Maybe relationships or communities. I mean, in the case of someone like Thomas, like what was the history of his connection that, you know, had him refusing to let go of faith, but finding possibilities for reshaping it into a way that worked for him on his own, which does sound really incredible. You write about, and you just mentioned this, the concept of theological doublespeak and narratives that are both harmful but enmeshed with life-sustaining narratives. And I thought this was a really interesting and complicated concept. I was wondering if you would be able to give some kind of an example of what this would look like, or how people would experience the theological doublespeak.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. That was a really rich finding that I was surprised by, because, in the clinical literature, it's often religion and spirituality and theology in the lives of LGBT people, particularly around suicide, is not treated with a lot of criticality or nuance. It's just sort of seen as, in many instances, as a risk factor alongside a lot of other risk factors that are named in the lives of LGBT people, family rejection, addiction, and all sorts of things like that. But there's not a lot of sort of investigation into how these narratives really operate. And in many cases, it's because that research isn't being done from a narrative framework. But what I found was these condemnatory and denigrating, death-dealing theological messages held so much power to inform a sense of self or soul or identity or connection to community, because they were running right alongside and entangled with other more positive and sustaining theological narratives. So, the difficulty was separating the two and being able to get some agential leverage in the midst of those entangled narratives. I'll read you another quote from Thomas, since we're on Thomas. I should use him as an exemplar of some of this research. He was talking about his experience as a child and how this theological doublespeak came to operate for him violently. Thomas said, "The message of Christ is love, and the message of Christ is damnation. In my heart, it's love, and in the world, it's damnation. And they use the same words. It was maddening. And a mind can't do that. A mind cannot fix that, ever. It's impossible. It's insane. And when you're paralyzed between those two things, God hates me and God loves me, when you're beaten enough with that, and you reach the point where, like, I'm done, it's a pain. It's a terrible pain. Maybe stronger people than me can deal with it, but I couldn't." So that was Thomas describing these messages of love and messages of damnation that not only came from the same sources of his religious community, faith leaders, but that also used the same language and imagery and terminology and drew on the same biblical narratives. And so when those were applied to his life, and particularly his sexual embodiment, that became too difficult for him to deal with, that contradiction of narratives. So that's what he spent the next 20 or 30 years of his life doing, is untangling those things. And, he didn't have a therapist to do that with him, or a pastor who knew how to accompany him on that journey. So it was a long and often painful journey for him, but he also had some very rich spiritual resources that he clung to from his upbringing. He talked about the Bible and the importance of the Bible for him. He talks about prayer as a spiritual resource. So he really stuck to some spiritual resources and narratives that were very close to the ones of his upbringing. Some of my other participants really moved into some other realms of religious practice altogether. I think that's the part that is missing in a lot of clinical literature, is realizing the complexity of how religious spiritual narratives come to construct a sense of self.
Yeah, as you're speaking, it has me thinking about folks, especially children, but people of any age in abusive relationships who are experiencing harm from someone who they also love and care for, and who they experience, have other experiences with. And it has me considering the responsibility that we hold as practitioners in whatever realm we're hosting and conversations about these realms. What have you got any advice for practitioners, narrative practitioners, as to the ways in which we might be able to ask into the multi-storied nature of people's relationships with these narratives?
Yeah, I think, a lot of the tools of narrative practice are so well suited for this work that I would hope that that many people dealing with this particular kind of theological narratival violence could have a narrative practitioner in their lives. One of the things I think for narrative practitioners to consider in working with people who are experiencing this, like theological doublespeak and things of that nature, is to ask questions beyond the harmful narratives. It's sort of that sense of needing to get to know the person outside the problem's influence in some ways. And there are really clear problem influences in these religious and spiritual narratives that I heard. But then there were these unique outcomes for people who had particular experiences or particular practices that, contrary to what I might have thought going into the research, or what a therapist might assume in working with someone around religious or theological violence, were surprisingly still powerful sources of life and meaning making for them. And a lot of the clinical literature, I think, treats the experience in a way that often encourages therapists and other helping practitioners to orient toward the work of helping an LGBT person remove themselves from that religious community or denomination or tradition or whatever, so that they aren't experiencing that theological soul violence any longer. The difficulty is when that doesn't come with the sense of importance that a lot of those narratives continue to hold for people. So, I mentioned some of my participants did make kind of breaks with their theological traditions and move into other traditions. Some of my participants also described the distress of having people or encourage them to go to this or that church because they would be embraced there, but they would go to that church and it was so much outside of the theological world that they were formed within that it was jolting, and it didn't make the same kind of theological sense, didn't have the same affective dimensions that they were looking for in a faith community. So being able to work around the pain of that and to help people make more critical decisions for themselves that are not these sort of broad brush, you need to leave this place and go to another. You need to separate from your religious tradition as operating violence, because a lot of that work is really hard and it takes time and careful conversation.
Yeah, and it also has me thinking about privilege and the ways in which for some folks a religious community may also be the only cultural community, may also be the ability to stay connected with family, and just layer upon layer, especially if folks are also contending with racism and colonization and other forces that expecting them to leave, as you say, in an uncritical way, sounds to me like a really harmful proposition in some cases.
Yeah, for sure. And oftentimes those experiences become even more complex when your cultural identity and your family identity and connection is bound up with your religious tradition, which it is for many people. And the condemnatory messages of the theological narratives that my participants were exposed to are often intensified by experiences of familial and social condemnation and rejection that they experienced, which is not a surprising finding, but it was surprising how that took place for some people, because it was often, so much more nuanced than one might assume in thinking about those narratives. It was often the case that the person was able to sort of do some theological work of their own on those theological narratives, such that they could recover a sense of connection, of relationship to God or Jesus or whomever they describe as their kind of religious connection. And that was in some ways helpful in preserving their life, literally their life, in the face of familial rejection and the condemnatory messages that they were able to tease apart in their theological tradition and reject and say that these are not working and they aren't how I understand my relationship to God or Christ or whatever. It's just I think the most beautiful part of the research was just how the participants developed the particular sets of tools, the narrative tools that they used to survive, when for the most part they didn't really have any help in doing that. It was just really incredible to hear.
Yeah, and it really strikes me that as a practitioner, the responsibility isn't to provide those tools, but to, all of this complex and skillful work is already being done. People are resisting and surviving all of the time up against, all of these interweaving forces, but to make visible the incredible nature of that survival. Another thing that you found out in your research, which wouldn't be surprising to most narrative practitioners, is that many folks found that helping others, or as you named it, developing altruistic collectivist spiritual praxis, was important for healing or resistance. And I wonder if you wanted to speak more to that.
Yeah, I didn't have that in mind going into the research. So it was a nice surprise to find the commonality between so many of the participants' narratives, but they all developed some individual spiritual practices that sustained them, whether that was holding on to some practices from their upbringing, like prayer and reading scripture and things of that nature. But for almost all of them, they also developed this sense that their spiritual life was bound up in their ability to help others and to act as agents of healing and restoration in the lives of other people. And that wasn't just like wanting to do good things for other people. It was how they made spiritual or theological meaning of their lives. One lesbian participant who told me about wanting to volunteer at an AIDS crisis center, or I think it might have actually been an AIDS hospice or something, in the city near where she grew up, and her parents forbade it because they didn't want her to be around gay people. It would be a bad influence on her. And so she signed up for some other kind of service learning project, but secretly she got on the train every day and went to the AIDS hospice and volunteered for like a year, doing this work because she found it important to her religious or spiritual identity to be engaged in that kind of work with other people, helping other people, improving other people's lives and ability to live. And, at the same time, I think that is evidence of this notion that came up in the research of developing a transgressive theological identity. You know, it wasn't just leaving a theological language or worldview or a set of discourses behind, but it was working with those transgressively. And so a quote that comes to mind from a participant named Silas, who was particularly, you know, like very energized by claiming this identity of having been a transgressor, or having been disordered, or having been offensive to others. And she said, I don't want to offend people, but I figure if I'm offending people anyway by just being gay, I might as well mix it up and try to be an activist for human rights while I'm at it. And so that was the, you know, not just rejecting the label, but taking the label and queering it in some way, like saying, yes, I'm going to be transgressive, and I'm going to be transgressive in a way that works against the violence of the narrative that I've been exposed to and their workings in life and society. And I'm going to work for other people's good and well-being. I think is a remarkable part of the resilience of these narratives that I heard from these participants.
Oh, it's so rich to hear about this work and all of the things that were shared with you from everyone you interviewed. I was wondering if there's anything else that you or the participants would want to be known by, you know, practitioners from all over the world, some of whom are working within religious and spiritual communities and practices, and others who aren't. But for anyone who's kind of watching this and wondering about how they may better support folks who are at the intersection of queerness and faith, what do you think would be an important takeaway from your research?
Sorry, I think not only from my research, but from the history of LGBTQ people who are doing work on spiritual narratives and spiritual community, it's a few things. One is that the picture of an LGBT person's religious, spiritual, theological life is just so much more rich and complex than is often portrayed, not only in popular media, but even in the clinical literature. And narrative tools are so helpful in bringing to life this complexity and honoring the complexity of those narratives. But the other thing is that LGBT people have been working on the margins of religious, spiritual, theological communities for, you know, ever, to create communities that are sustaining of life and justice. And, you know, I don't know if this will, you know, translate well into other cultural and national contexts, but in the U.S., the very first church that was founded by LGBTQ people was founded by a group of Catholic parishioners who had told their priests about 6 or 8 parishioners who had told their priest about their sexual identities, struggles, and things of that nature. And the priest stopped serving them communion. So they would come to the altar rail every week, and the priest would pass them by, wouldn't serve them the communion. The Eucharist, really central practice in the Catholic tradition. And so eventually this group, along with some others in the parish who were really upset by this act by the priest, went down the road and rented space in a hotel lounge, pushed some cocktail tables together for an altar, and they founded what became the Eucharistic Catholic Church. And usually when I tell this story to any audience, LGBT audiences, religious leaders, nobody knows this story. And I learned it from a queer religious historian named Heather Rachel White, who's uncovered a lot of these forgotten narratives. And I ask every audience to guess where this happened. And most people guess, you know, New York, where the Stonewall riots occurred, or LA or San Francisco, big queer cities, you know. But it happened in Atlanta, Georgia, which is the heart of the American South, a very conservative region of the United States. And I asked people to guess when this took place, and everybody guesses something like, you know, the 60s or early 70s, sometime around Stonewall, that kind of thing. This happened in 1946. 1946, Atlanta, Georgia. And even more remarkably, and this I think is evidence of this sense of like being transgressive theologians working toward the livability of other people's lives, is that in 1946, Atlanta, Georgia, this started as a racially integrated congregation. It started as a congregation that had people from across denominational lines, Catholics, Protestants, even people from other religious traditions who wanted to be a part of this community. And, you know, it was a community that contained gay, straight, trans, cisgender people. I mean, this was a remarkable feat of working against the dominant narratives of not only LGBTQ narratives and religious traditions, but racial narratives, but structured society, and other things like that. That I think those are stories of resilience that are contained within collective queer religious history. But that same kind of beauty, I think, is also contained in every individual LGBT person's ability to work with and work on theological and spiritual narratives and practices toward the livability of life.
Oh, what an incredible story. And so amazing that folks like yourself and that historian and so many other people are making these narratives visible and known by others, and all of the things that might not have been possible within many religious traditions were it not for LGBT people. Thank you so much for taking the time, Cody, and thanks for your work.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this conversation. I appreciate it.